Hi, it's Andrew Eborn here again on the Andrew Eborn Show, and I'm delighted whenever we have regular guests. And one of my very special regular guests is Jonathan Goldsmith. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm okay, Andrew. How are you?
I am incredibly well, and the feedback to our last session together was tremendous. They loved it. What I love about this sort of opportunity, even in lockdown, is people sharing this sort of experiences and working out it's okay not to be okay, as we keep saying. And it's been really good. And now things are sort of easing off a bit, and people going out tentatively into the big outside world. I thought it'd be great to get you back, because one of the things you hinted at in our conversations in between was this thing about radical acceptance. And I thought that it'd be great to bring you back and start talking about some of those things that you've been developing. Because there's that famous prayer, isn't there? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Is that the right sort of track?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's one of the absolute key things and one of the best things out of it comes from the 12-step programs. But yeah, completely. I think there's so much in there. Although I would like to just back up and just go, this idea of things easing up, actually, I think is completely the opposite. I think things are getting more and more difficult as restrictions and the social norms are changing. It's actually making it much more complex, because we could all understand stay in and protect the NHS. Yeah. We could all understand that because we knew what the rules were. Stay in. The thing that's happening now is there's so much that's open for interpretation. And actually, I think it's much more complex now. I think people are, from both my work and anecdotally experiencing many more challenges than they were. Even at the beginning of lockdown, there was a period of adjustment, but we all knew what we had to do. Now, people are, it's a much more, stay safe is a much more looser frame than because everyone has their own map of what safety is. And that will change depending on your age and your circumstances and what you need to stay safe. And this idea that, things are easing, actually, I think things are getting much more complex.
And I think you're right on that. The real problem is that it's become politicized. And even hearing the Prime Minister speaking yesterday about care homes and partly in the language that was used, attributing some sort of blame, the backlash to that has been tremendous, hasn't it? And I think what we have to do is avoid sound bites just for the sake of sound bites. Like stay at home, as you say. Everybody understood stay at home. You stay at home. Stay alert. What does that mean? You suddenly turn around on that sort of basis. And the biggest thing, we've spoken about this before, Jonathan, as well, the biggest thing that spreads is fear itself. It's the biggest selling tool for anything. And when we first heard about the pandemic, what happened is people panic bought because it's fear. It's fear that you're going to lose something if you don't grab it all. So all these toilet rolls and other products which are being taken off the shelves, dry products, was as a result of fear, wasn't it?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think we were in a very unknown space, but realistically, we didn't, although we may have run out of toilet roll on the shelves for the first couple of weeks, actually, what happened in the last couple of months is people just found a new normal. I mean, there may have been people that struggled, but we all found our new normal through it, and we all understood what we had to do. I think more and more people are differently interpreting how, what it means, and, do you go round to somebody's house, and do you go to the bathroom, and do you not, and do you go to the pub, and do you not, and, watching, the great comment about that came from that drunk people don't know how to socially distance. Well, that's pretty clear. And then that's going to evoke different things. And there are so many different competing, some people are just going out without fear, and realistically, again, there is a politicization in this, where it doesn't become about what's right. It becomes about whether it's about a narrative that's being shared by, you know, a politics. And you see that, especially in the States. I mean, and it's here as well.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. It then becomes, rather than solution, it becomes the blame game, and I hate it when any problem really becomes politicized on that sort of basis. You have the bravado of, I'm not going to wear a mask, you know, because it's against our human right to wear a mask. And you turn around and think, well, think about it logically. You're not wearing the mask just for you, but actually to stop other people getting it. And I think if you're going to follow those sort of rules, and what I've loved about what we've done in sort of lockdown on this program is we've talked to people around the world and the different approach that they've had. And some of the politicians, because they tend to be the front people, some of the politicians have come out as real heroes. So like in New Zealand, you know, the Prime Minister there is tremendous, a real hero, down to earth, fantastic lady who will turn around during an earthquake, carry on with the sort of conversations that she has, and she gains people's respect because she talks about it logically and with authority and listens to the experts. When we just focus on sound bites and getting re-elected, it's a different matter, isn't it?
Sure, and I also think that bleeds through into the format that we're communicating through, which is social media. You know, I think social media becomes more and more of a toxic place because we do reduce arguments. There is no grey area. There is no middle ground. You're either for or against. You're either pro or anti. And I think it means that these conversations, and especially with the political change that's happening, you know, more and more people are, you know, polarizing. And I think, you know, that is the very nature of social media. How do you develop a, you know, sophisticated argument in 200 characters?
Yeah, and you're right. And the trouble is, the other thing about social media is all the people all those months ago who were experts on constitution, all of a sudden became virologists and all become experts on history and that sort of stuff. And like most things in the media, it's all about extremes, isn't it? You cannot have just a middle ground. You have this sort of extreme here and you've got to have this view, and people then search for evidence to support that extreme view. And in the current climate, it's possible. You can get any view supported by any evidence. And the reality is the truth lies somewhere between all those different points, doesn't it? I always say that you should get your news from many different sources. We start with the BBC, look at ITV, then go over to Al Jazeera, have a look at CNN, look at Fox, and see how they report the same story, but in a different way.
Oh, completely. I mean, there's a teacher of many of my teachers came through UC Santa Cruz in the 1970s, and there was an anthropologist. He was actually a polymath. He did many things called Gregory Bateson, and one of Gregory Bateson's great contributions was in cybernetic thinking or systemic thinking. And his view was, in order to know something, you need to take at least 3 different perspectives. And that's you know, something there's an ancient Hindu tale of the 3 blind men and the elephant, which is basically essentially a parable of how, in order to know something, you can't just take one perspective. You need to take multiple positions. Sure. And that's the antithesis of what people are doing. They're looking for confirmation bias. They have a belief and they go out and look for evidence that confirms their own belief. And then you have people with different values. And, you know, from one perspective to the other perspective, I mean, I see this in my work as a couples therapist. So I'm quite, you know, intimately experienced where people have very different polarized views based on their values. And, you know, I think this is where, you know, there is a level of acceptance. You know, there's acceptance of self. You know, I don't really know what the right thing to do is. There may not be, you know, a definitive right, because we are also in unknown territory. There is, you know, people, it's, even if you have a theory, it's still based on interpretation of data. So we have to do what's right for ourselves, but listening to ourselves and recognizing that what my view of what right is may not be mirrored out in the world, and finding a way to accept that. Sure, that's a big challenge, I think, you know, and what's interesting is, you know, everyone I'm speaking to and certainly everyone I'm working with is doing what's right for them. It's trying to find a way and then trying to find out how that works.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you talk about prejudice bias. I mean, that's what happens is people, rather than searching, questioning everything. I always urge people question everything, because so often reality and perception are not aligned, and people have a particular perception of something, and they will feed that prejudice, that perception, with evidence which they're looking for, whilst disregarding everything else. And even in the sort of current climate, it's especially important, isn't it, to sort of turn around and surround yourself with experts with different opinions. The most impressive people actually during all these things with the interviews are not the politicians with their sound bites, but actually the scientists who tell you, okay, this is what it's about, this is why we're trying to search for this is what history's happened, and so we can try and set that into the right sort of perception, if you like. And I think that's important, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex thing because we live in a post-truth world, you know. I mean, you know, when we have politicians telling us to ignore the experts, you know, we're in Wonderland. You know, experts are experts for a very particular reason, because they've built up an expertise in a field. Doesn't mean that they're right all the time. But you know, this whole idea that you can't trust the experts, well, what does that even mean? And then it creates this unnecessary chaos, and especially, you know, society is consensus reality. You know, society is based on the very fact that we all agree to a social contract. And if the social contract is up to individual interpretation, well, that's where you know, chaotic things can happen. And as human beings, what we like least in the world is we look for stability. So we hate chaos. And I think these are challenging times because the rules there are so many different rules within the social contract. And I think, you know, then it does get politicized. And, you know, this idea that in the, you know, certainly in the UK, there's a narrative between politics versus science. I mean, I find that slightly bewildering, but, you know, I think you just got to go, it's a product of the times that we live in. And I think, you know, I think I said this in the last conversation we had, the idea that things are going to go back to normal, I think is actually the worst idea that we can come up with. I think the opportunity is to find what the new normal is, both for ourselves and for our relationships and for, you know, our society. Because we need to kind of come out and go, if we just go back to the way things were, then we don't change anything.
And you're absolutely right. And even talking about a new normal, what's normal? We celebrate difference. We celebrate the abnormal, because it's only by doing that you can try and make things move forward. But I think certainly on a positive side, what the lockdown and what these extraordinary times have made us realize, it shone a spotlight, if you like, on the things that we took for granted. You know, the simple things in life, whether it's hugging a friend, because people who are tactile, whether it's just sort of being able to communicate, being one-to-one, sitting down in a restaurant or having a cup of coffee somewhere with somebody, all the things we took for granted. Hopefully we're going to shine a new acceptance, if you like, on how important those things are.
Sure. I think also, you know, what I'm noticing more and more, and obviously, you know, I have a bias just because people come to me with their problems, is actually what I'm finding great is that people have said, you know, during this lockdown, I've realized that there's been something that I've been, you know, avoiding dealing with or struggling with for all these years. And actually now's the time to address that, you know, and it's recognizing, you know, and again, acceptance isn't, here's something that's bad, I accept it. Acceptance in my map and this idea of radical acceptance is, you know, there is something that's bad, you know, I see it for the bad thing that it is. And I recognize that my acceptance is, where is my choice? It's not trying to make a bad thing okay. It's saying this is bad, so what do I do about it?
Yeah, and I think that's right, isn't it? Because by the time you get to the acceptance of it, you realize that you avoid, or partly avoid, the frustration. Because and it's human nature, I always like to try to solve things. If there's a problem, I'll try and solve it. And sometimes people say it's a difference between men and women and so on and so forth. They rather than just say, here's a problem, just accept it. We're always looking for a solution. And sometimes there isn't a solution, is there?
Yeah, and actually to admit that we are powerless. And again, you know, one of the great, what I really like, there's a lot, it's a complex conversation about 12-step programs, but this idea that we are powerless, you know, and a lot of people bulk at the idea of how is it a positive thing to accept that we're powerless over certain situations, you know. But that's where we can, you know, that's where the Serenity Prayer is, to go, well, if I can have the serenity to accept there are certain things I cannot change, or there may be certain things I cannot influence. I've tried and tried again to change this relationship or change this work dynamic, or to accept something inside of me, or to just get on with it, or to go, if only I had more skill or will, or just try it again. But actually to go, actually my acceptance is go, it doesn't work. So then you can then go, well, once you've got the acceptance, you can then move forward into, well, what are my choices?
Yeah,
And it's an liberating thing.
Yeah, and that has to be sound advice, doesn't it? Even thinking about it just logically, you work on that sort of premise. But this is why it's so important when if the politicians tend to be the people who vocalize all these different elements, and they'll hopefully talk to experts such as yourself, and talk to the scientists, and talk to communicators, because it's all about the message. Because if the message is not clear, it leads to further confusion, and further confusion leads to insecurity and leads to doubt, and so on and so forth. And all the issues facing us at the moment, I think the biggest problem is that lack of communication, and it's epitomized, as you say, by stay at home. We understood that. Stay alert, what does that mean? We don't really know. But then you're mixing as well two messages. One is the health of the nation and the wealth of the nation. And the two are interrelated, because people are turning around and say, look, why is it okay that people can hop on a plane, but they can't sit next to each other in a theatre? You know, that's a communication problem, isn't it? You turn around and can't somebody just explain that very, very clearly? So look, this is why you're allowing one, but not the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all about interpretation, and realistically, it's also about, you know, what the difference between, I guess, what a politician's trying to do is create a lowest common denominator, or one size fits all soundbite, because that's what they need to do in this day and age. But it doesn't work, you know, because realistically, you know, we'll all have different priorities, and we'll all have different needs and priorities. And then you're made to feel, well, I'm the odd one out if I, you know, I need this in my life, but I don't need that. What I really need in my life is the ability to find a way to have someone to support my childcare. I don't give a shit about going to the pub. Versus, do you know what I really need? I've been isolated. I'm young, I'm isolated. And what I really need to do is find a way to safely gather with my friends. And, you know, I was watching some of the narratives around some of the parties that, you know, especially in London, that were broken up. You know, and the soundbite that I took away, that it wasn't a soundbite, it was you know, it's going, well, if 500,000 people can go to Bournemouth Beach, why can't 200 people gather in a courtyard and listen to music? You know, why are there riot police outside these 200 people gathering in a courtyard versus, you know, no policing of, you know, even if you look at the pictures again from Soho on Saturday night, or when everyone did flock to the beach, and that incongruency, because you go, well, my way of celebrating is I'm no interest in going to Bournemouth Beach, but I want to dance with my friends. I mean, I've got no view on, you know, I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on viruses or on, you know, how things are passed or contagious, but you can, as someone who looks at humanity, you can certainly understand the human conditioning in that. You know, and you can.
I have to say that's one of the most refreshing things I've had any of my guests say, is that I'm not an expert on viruses, because so many people are experts at everything. It's extraordinary, but very refreshing. I love that. But you're right, and I live, as you know, in the centre of London, and the press will report one side of it. So those pictures of Soho on a Saturday night, I went to many places. I walked down Oxford Street. I've been doing this throughout the pandemic, and giving people an actual live view of what's happening. And the stores were deserted. Some of that Hamleys, the biggest toy store in the world, nobody there, just me chatting to some of the people about the things going on. Nike, you know, on the corner of Oxford Street, which shows the pictures of queues and queues and queues of people. I went along on that Super Saturday, it was deserted. Same with London Zoo. I went a few times to London Zoo, one on the very first week it opened, and it's basically just me and the animals because everybody's so scared about going out. And if people manage those expectations, say, look, social distancing is going to be in place for some time. What does that actually mean? It means that we can open things up, but you just need to keep your distance. Don't stay away, because if you stay away, the economy will just collapse. But let's do it in a responsible way. And it goes back to what I was saying beforehand about having a clear message. Because if you only show the extremes on the news, you only show the crowded beaches, oh my goodness, if I go there, if I go out, I'm going to get this virus, then people are going to be so scared they're not going to do anything, are they?
Sure, but it's there's the conversation about news only existing to show sensational pieces. There's a 1970s writer, I can never pronounce his last name, Rob Renese, who talks about he talks about why are we only looking at the negative in the world? The world is full of magic and wonder. Why don't we have it's slightly old hippie idea, but why don't we talk about positive news, and why don't we talk about the positive things? Because that's how the news exists. And I think the thing is that, as to advise as a human being, if you feel overwhelmed by the narratives that are created in the news or on social media or both, take a break. And it's really about for you to work out, what's right for you. What do you want is, as each individual person, to go, what do I want to bring forward into this new phase? I mean, it may not be as simple as that, because of course everybody has different needs. Some people are medically isolating, some people are working out what to do with their jobs, some people don't have a choice. But again, it's trying to listen to oneself, and then just to go, in accepting a situation that's outside of your control, you can go, what do I need in order for that to make that situation okay for me? In radically accepting something, it's opposite of surrendering. It's actually empowering people to go, so what do I need? What self-care do I then bring in order to help me radically accept a situation?
But part of acceptance as well, though, has to come from understanding. So when you're looking for any situation, you've got to say, look, first of all, I had to understand this situation. I presume, and that's it. Going back to what we said at the start, you understand the situation, and then you work out, is there something I can change or something I just have to accept? Because if you don't understand the situation, you don't even get to the stage of trying to accept it, do you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels of understanding. I mean, again, it depends where you get your information from. It depends what you're trying to understand. If you're trying to go, I need to understand how, the world's going to be over the next few months. I might be, it might be an impossible Sisyphean task, but if I can understand how I feel about it, then I can work towards that. So it's at what level the understanding's at. Recognizing it's all narrative, news is narrative, politics is narrative. I mean, I come from a discipline that believes in research, but it also believes in paradigm shifts. We're not always right. Our theories are still theories. At one point we were the center of the universe and the world was flat, and then amazing. You mean we go around the sun? So we're always, looking to update and get our best sense of what the information is now. But I think what people can do is, I think one of the big problems with our age is that we don't allow for contrast. It's right or wrong. We don't allow for the gray area of discussion. We don't have, it's just people shouting at each other from, either behind their keyboards or, whenever it is, from face to face. There's no discussion. There's no sense of a middle way. And it does make things, I think, it is one of the absolute, shadows of our time, is that there is a complete lack of narrative in politics. And, then you see that reflected in the news where, talking heads are just shouting different opinions at one another, not really conversing.
Well, and
And,
it's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. As they say, it should be jaw, jaw, not war, war. I think if you work on that and that sort of principle, and try and the way I like to approach things, like maybe the training as a lawyer, is you'll try and look from the other person's perspective. What's the argument? What's the best argument you could give them? Because that's what lawyers do. They're only paid mouthpieces. So our job is always to try and create, to weave the best possible case for a client. And if you approach that from the other person's perspective and just listen and question everything, then maybe that will help with that sort of understanding.
Sure. I mean, I had the pleasure of being trained by, she studied in comparative religion and culture, an amazing woman called Theologian-philosopher. She was from America, and she used to have a saying which she would bring into the training rooms, which was, you do not judge someone until you've walked a mile in their moccasins. It's that kind of English anglicized version of it was American Indian saying, and exactly that. How do you try and have understanding unless you've got that sense of being able to empathize?
And I think that's a part of obviously your training and how you help people is to talk through that sort of side. So let's, at the moment, everybody said they focused, and it's been on the news a lot, they recognize that these extraordinary times where it is about extremes, and every newspaper and every media screams at the story, as P.T. Barnum said, if you want to draw a crowd, start a fight. Well, that's what we're doing in the media. They're all there and everybody's going at each other. The problem is it's dividing society, because you're either on this side or you're on that side. There's no middle ground. And that causes a big problem, doesn't it? So when people recognize that this is causing mental health issues, and we talked about that last time, they come along to you. What do you say?
Well, I mean, I think the division in society is mirrored in division in self. Often what people do is they are unable to accept, the parts of self. I mean, you would describe it as the shadow, the parts of self that have become unacceptable. If I was brought up in a family and I was never allowed to express anger, my anger becomes something that is inhuman to me. So, part of my job is helping people find, to build a relationship with the parts of self that have been dehumanized over the years through, their family or school, social interaction. So, my job is to help integration in self. And I think if you learn how to integrate in self, interpersonal relationships, there's a saying in relational psychotherapy, which is the distance between one human being and another human being is the same as the distance between one human being and themselves. So the closer that you're able to help people integrate with themselves, the more that they're able to bring that skill into interpersonal or, societal relationships. So, the first thing I do is go, well, how do you treat yourself? How's your relationship with yourself? How are you accepting your anxiety? Often people go, please get rid of, will you come and get rid of this for me? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to get rid of your depression. I'll give you some tools so you can build a relationship with it. So it doesn't have to devastate and destroy your house, but I'm not going to get rid of it for you. It's there for a reason,
We touched on this last time, and some of the tools, and it is that sort of acceptance that because you do feel better once you've realized you can't change something, you feel a bit more comforted about that, don't you? Because it's you're avoiding the frustration of trying to say, look, I should be able to fix this, but some things are not fixable. I mean, that's sort of effectively what we're talking about. But you mentioned about some of the tools, and I know a lot of the viewers, the millions around the world who tune in to watch you, what happens is they get a lot of comfort when we talk about, in that soundbite way, but also look at it a bit more depth, about specific tips that you would give them when they start looking at this sort of stuff. What are those tips? Give me some of them.
I get the question. I think the thing is for me, it's really difficult to give a catch-all tip because, often, I mean, I live in a world of personal development is one way of putting what therapy sits in. And, you go to, on Amazon, or if bookshops actually exist, you go to a bookshop, there's swaths of books saying, this is the way, the way I often look at them is that they are sledgehammers trying to crack a walnut. often there's too much, I'm using a generalization. There can be too much like, this is the path. I think recognizing that you have capabilities, trying to see that whatever you're suffering with is not your only story, and then to find things in your life that work for you. Because, sometimes I work with people who've experienced an incredible amount of suffering in their lives. And, some of the stories that I hear or people have, and I say, wow, it's really amazing you're still here. And I mean that, because there must be some level of resilience inside of you to have gone through that. I don't know, I can't remember if I had read the book on our last interview, but one of my favorite therapists, Viktor Frankl, if I did mention this, talks about, he lived through a number of concentration camps in the Second World War. And he talks about how people survive and what resilience is. I think something around finding meaning in your narrative. But that will be individual to each person. There's there's commonalities in how I work. So tips, how are you connected into your body? We talked about exercise last time. I'm a big fan of breathing in all its forms. But it's also going, well, why am I doing this? What's my purpose to the world? I think it's one of the biggest questions we can ask ourselves. If we don't have the answer, maybe get, some support in trying to help answer it for ourselves. So, because if we can find what does the world want from me? What's the purpose of my individual suffering? Where do I connect into that? How do I utilize that? How do I bring that? Because there's some kind of gift that is inside of that. I recognize that can be a big stretch for people in the thick of it.
Absolutely. And that's the problem, because we're taught from an early age that we have to have a purpose. And we're set on a little thing in relationships. If you start dating, the next question they ask you is when you're going to get engaged. Once you're engaged, the next question is when you're going to get married. Once you're married, the next question is when you're going to get a kid. Once you've got a kid, when's the next one? You're set on a set pattern each time in society. And part of that is that people have to have a job to define their worth. These extraordinary things, and the statistics we're given blinded by every single day, is a lot of people are now not going to have that life-defining situation where they have a job. What do you say to them during this time?
Yeah, well, I think that what society's done is co-opted the idea of purpose and created it within a narrative that fits in our economic system. So, we all had a purpose. We are born, we're in this world. We can say, well, what does the world want from us? Or, depending on your connection to spirituality, you might say, what does the universe want from us? But what's happened is that's been subliminated into, well, my purpose needs to be defined by my identity through my job. Well, I think actually we can come back to personal purpose. We can come back to personal meaning. Rather than going, I define my meaning by my job or my status or my wealth or my car or my social circle or my relational status or all of that. They're all external. It's about connecting inwards and going, well, what gets me out of bed in the morning? Again, this is for the same teacher, Sir Judith Delosier. She asked a wonderful question. She said, how do you want to spend your heartbeats? Yeah. And that's not what job do you want to do. That's how do you want to spend your heartbeats? I love that as a question, because it's about going, well, what do I want to do within this world?
It's a very powerful question. So Jonathan Goldsmith, how do you want to spend your heartbeats?
Well, I spend my heartbeats doing, I think one of the first things is to ask myself that question repeatedly, not presuppose that there's one fixed answer or that we're always going to have the same question. I check in with myself and go, am I trying to move towards my purpose? And if I don't, I go, well, today not such a good day, or today it too shall pass. But it's really checking in. You asked last time about why I'd done, I'd gone through different phases of careers, and definitely I feel like my personal contribution is to do what I do. You know, I love doing what I do. Not always and not every context, but you know, it gives me that sense of answering, well, what do I want to contribute to the world? So yeah, sure. You know, and at the same time, it's a question that you continually ask oneself. So yeah, that's how I can answer that in a way.
Well, and it is difficult for people because a lot of people, and if they had an honest answer, and yours is an honest answer, and I would say something very similar. You know, I live every day as though it's my last, which sounds as though it's dramatic, but I always say to people, I used to say to people that when I was growing up, people used to say to me, "Oh, I wish I did this at your age," and I always say, "Well, why didn't you? And you still got a chance to do it." Because the worst thing in life is at the end of it coming back and saying, that sort of regret, if you like. It's much better to say, look, I tried it, it didn't work, at least I've tried it. The problem is as well, though, defining people by saying you have to have a purpose. And I think a lot of people now will say, sadly, that their purpose is survival.
But there's nothing wrong with that. You know, and at the end of the day, you know, again, there was something about comparison in there. You know, we can't compare. We can't. I think, you know, all for me, the great therapists, and possibly with the philosophers, would say you can't compare suffering, and you also can't compare any individual. Everyone's unique, you know, in their own state. And you know, there's a lovely Shakespeare quote: "All comparison is odious." You know. And it's like, and so, you know, in terms of redefining what your meaning is, well, there's nothing wrong with going, I want to survive, I want to have, you know, or want to move into thriving, or, you know, but there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's about recognizing whether people refine their own purpose for themselves and then work out how that fits into the greater scheme, you know. And it might be, it doesn't have to be, we can touch the world in whichever way we want, you know, and then work out how that fits in and how our jobs support that and our social structures and our family structures support that. And again, you know, too often we were defined by our careers. You know, too often there was social capital in what we're doing. Our identity gets stuck with, you know, I'm not Jonathan Goldsmith, I'm a therapist, and if I'm not a therapist, then what I am. You know, I asked the question of my supervisor. I said at the beginning of this, you know, when all my client work was up in the air, I said, you know, if a therapist is doing therapy in the forest and there's no one there, is he still a therapist?
That was about the tree, whether it actually fell down. Actually, nobody's there to hear.
Exactly. But it's my own meaning. I redefined it. I found purpose in other ways. You know, it's like, you know, it's like asking it from a very small thing, and it doesn't have to be big things. It's like, maybe I just want to be nice. Maybe I just, you know, right at the beginning of lockdown, the way I answered that was maybe I just bring a bit of kindness into the world. Maybe I just smile at some extra strangers. Maybe I do, you know, stop and have a conversation with someone I might not have a conversation with. It can be redefined in the moment. And recognizing now, especially, I feel for people who, you know, I recognize my privilege that I'm able to work. There are so many people who don't work. I work with so many people in the entertainment industries. And, you know, again, you know, I feel for people in film and art and music and theatre who are suffering terribly, and they're recognizing and going, you know, this idea, you know, the government have said, as I read it, and again, I'm not sure if it's true or not, that young people who have lost their jobs in hospitality or entertainment can go on some kind of 6-month retraining scheme. I don't know if you read that there's like an apprenticeship scheme, you know, so it's almost like we're losing the lifeblood out of our industries. But if I'm an actor, you know, one of the questions, you know, when I work with actors is like, well, if I'm not acting, am I an actor? Yeah. You know, but it's and the answer is well, you know, how do you define that for yourself? I mean, there have been, and at the same time, I've watched some of the people who are fortunate enough to be able to do it. I've watched some brilliant things that have come out of lockdown. Don't know if you watched the BBC short with David Tennant and Michael Sheen. I think it was one of the best things that I've seen and made me belly laugh, and I really needed to belly laugh. And you know, in terms of separating out what's meaning versus how do I make my way in the world, how do I pay my mortgage, how do I pay my rent, you know, man, I think we can look at personal meaning and helping people to rediscover personal meaning.
And often, that's right. It's going back to purpose, isn't it? Because if you define purpose as who you are rather than what you do, then it gives you that sort of flexibility, doesn't it? Even the whole be kind movement, or be nice, or make somebody smile, or because there's so much to do which is free in London. I mean, even just walking around, I mean, stuff where you don't have to spend a fortune doing things. You can just walk into an area to get a bit of fresh air. You can just smile at people and have a good conversation. All of these are free. But the reality is, as soon as you define purpose by what you do rather than who you are, that's when the problem starts, isn't it?
Sure. And I was thinking, often there's a correlation but when people are coming to see me where they might be dealing with, a lack of mental well-being. And that's often correlated with a sense of, and I don't know what I'm doing. I want to find my passion, or I want to find my purpose. So I think there is a correlation between the more that you are in touch with yourself, the more that you can define how you interact with the world and interface with the world. I think the two great questions is, what do I want from the world, and what does the world want from me? And again, you can ask that in a macro and then on the daily level, and we might have to make adjustments. I think there's another saying, disappointment takes adequate preparation. If we have a fixed view, and recognizing, of course, then there's the life practicalities. How do I pay my bills? How do I get food on the table? How do I feed myself? And recognizing that it's not meant to be a pithy question. And so if survival is, what you need to concentrate on now, then survive. Yeah. That's your purpose. And there's nothing that's laudable.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's as you say, it's a recognition. If we're doing this sort of radical acceptance, then that's that recognition that it's okay. In the same way as we use the phrase, it's okay not to be okay, that recognition will help remove the stigma. And as you know, I'm passionate about making sure we talk about mental health issues so that we are the generation who will talk about it, so the next generation doesn't have to suffer the stigma. I think that in itself is really, really powerful. But the other thing I've had the pleasure and the privilege of having all sorts of people on the show, including the Queen's chaplain. And I asked him, a lovely chap called Canon Roger Hall, whose church is in the Tower of London, of all places. Glorious church. But I asked him, I said, I mean, nowadays, people trying to understand prayer, whatever people's religious views are, firstly, how does God decide which prayers to answer, which not to answer? And secondly, in the current situation, why is nobody's prayer being answered to get it finished? And you sort of turn around and think, well, it becomes then really quite tricky, doesn't it? And quite sort of frustrating to work out how people can get some sort of comfort, because religion is a big comfort for a lot of people and their beliefs and so on and so forth. How do you deal with that?
Well, I'll tell the very brief version. There's an old joke, village is flooding and everyone's leaving the village on buses, and the last person in the village is a man. He goes, no, I don't need to leave on the bus. God will save me, I'm a religious person. And the flooding continues, and he's up to his first floor window, and a boat comes by and he says, come on, we're going to rescue you. And he goes, no, I'm a religious person, God will save me. And then he's on his roof, and it's the helicopter, and the waves are lapping up in his feet. The helicopter drops a ladder down and goes, come on, we're rescuing you. He goes, I don't need rescuing. I'm a religious person. God will save me. And the man drowns, and he's at the gates of heaven, and he demands an audience with God. And he goes, God, I'm a religious person. I pray every day. Why didn't you save me? And God looks at him and says, I sent you a bus, a boat, and a helicopter. What more do you need? And the reason I tell that joke, because if you go back to the Serenity Prayer, it's God grant me the serenity. It's like, it's not saying God grant me the yacht. It's like, it's saying, a part of one way of looking at prayer is it's meditation, and it's very much, the idea of prayer as meditation. I think it's been, seeped out of religion, and it's about going, well, if you have a connection to a higher power or whatever you believe in, and or faith or whatever you want to say. You can say, well, it's my attempt to work out, it's my internal process that I'm really working on. It's not saying, unfair things happen. The universe can be a very bad place. Terrible things happen to people. But how do I hold my faith into this? And it's helping people to kind of come to that again. What meaning do they want to make out of it?
Sure.
Do they see the signs? Does that make, it's like, if you're waiting for something else, and I think faith, a loss of faith or a reconnection to faith can be an incredible, powerful tool. Whatever faith means to each individual person, it doesn't have to be religious faith. Faith in humanity, faith in family, faith in whatever is a part of the therapeutic work. That answers your question.
No, I think that's right. I know a number of people have spoken about this very eloquently. Things like the poem "Footsteps," and they use and often quote that when people say, "Where was God during this moment?" And you had footsteps through your life, but in the very challenging times, there's only one set of footsteps which are own. And the answer was, well, during those very difficult times, I was carrying you. That sort of side was that sort of element. So I think when you get difficult times, it does call all of these things into question. And when you're trying, everything's spinning around in your head, it adds to that anxiety. So an anxiety feeds itself, doesn't it?
Sure. And if you're in, for people who are really suffering with the practicalities of life, to go, well, you got through that day, congratulations, to feel that actually it's an achievement, that, and especially, with the different pulls on people in terms of financial support or looking after kids or schooling, some days I would say, well, if you got through that day and you survived, congratulations, give yourself that, so that, to go, well done, you don't need to change the world or rediscover things. It's not about thriving, it's survival. And to recognize that if you just give yourself credit for getting through that, that's enough. But people don't. People judge themselves. Oh, I could be doing more. I should have written my manual, tell what I'm doing. Should have written my novel. I should have made that. I should have learned the Spanish, And they give themselves such a hard time for not having achieved something rather than looking at what it is they've actually achieved.
Yeah, and I think, looking into this and talking about being radically accepting, I think from what I understand, there are three elements to it. There's one is self-kindness. The other is sort of radical acceptance, which we touched on. And the other thing is what we call emotional agility. Talk me through those three different things. You said we touched a fair bit on radical acceptance. Talk
Sure.
me through the relevant elements.
So the first thing is to accept this part. If life is bad, we go, life is bad. I accept that life is bad. I'm not going to go, it's my fault that life is bad. I accept that that's happening. And then I look at where my choices are. And I think the next step is this idea of, they're kind of parallel steps. It's the idea of, then practicing self-kindness, recognizing that we often have the capability of doing our own damage to ourselves through the way that we talk to ourselves or the lack of self-care that we put in. People, pre-COVID, I work with people in quite intense industries. I've just worked, a 60-hour week in 4 days and I'm exhausted and I'm not giving myself a break. Well, give yourself, some kindness. How are you looking after yourself? How are you treating yourself? How are you talking to yourself? And emotional agility is also, this kind of links into the other two, going, well, there are times you're going to feel sad. There are times you're going to feel depressed or anxious. But emotional agility is the theory of the idea that all of our emotions have a place in us and we need to have a relationship with them. We need to know what to do. If something's happened and I feel sad, it's not to rail against the thing that's happened. It's to go, well, I accept the sadness inside me. I know my sadness has a place. What do I do for myself when I'm sad? And how do I, salve the sadness? How do I hold the sadness in such a way that it can be looked after? It's not, it's accepting that, we have the full range of human emotions. They all have their place. Sadness tells us something about value sometimes, or anxiety tells us something about what's important. So if we can understand what those emotions are trying to tell us, treat them with kindness, not I reject my sadness because it's unbearable. I reject my anxiety because it's not useful. I accept it inside me. I treat it with kindness. And then I'd go, well, what can I change? God grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change. What can I change? Give me the courage to change the things I can, and give me the wisdom to know the difference, and to just be nice to ourselves, and to accept that all of these things are part of being human. You know, if you go, I have no place for my sadness in my life. When sadness comes, we don't have the tools to deal with it. Often, people may not have been given the resources or been taught, you know, especially if people have had difficult childhoods or, you know, trauma in their lives, and no one ever taught them how to deal with that archetypal moment of sadness or stress or fear or grief. So people need to learn the skills themselves, but they're all part of being human. I welcome my sadness as much as I welcome my happiness, because they both tell me something about what it is for me to be human.
And it is interesting, because if you look at societies where, and the pressures on society, I'm sure, I know many books have been written on it, and you get certain societies that dictate you have to behave a certain way, and you're quashing what is a sort of human nature. What happens is it's like a pressure cooker, isn't it? And so you will find that sometimes people who cannot display emotion, for example, in certain societies you're not allowed to do that, actually deep down inside you then have these explosions. And sometimes I imagine when you're advising people about relationships, it's actually very healthy to have explosions every now and again, because that's human, and then you can patch up and so on and so forth. Is that fair?
100%. You know, when a couple come to me, I say, you know, just to say, I'm not going to teach you how not to argue. I'm going to teach you how to argue and or work or explore how to argue, and then to come back, so you don't need to destroy each other. You know, arguments are part of growth, you know, and so, but you will argue, but it doesn't have to be as toxic as what's happening for you right now. So yeah, absolutely. Sadness is a part of being. We need to have a place for all these parts, you know, and I think it's both society, you know, the great English question, and how are you today? And we're forced into this like, oh yeah, I'm fine. Of course we're not fine, you know, but people don't want to know the answer. It's like this, or, you know, I saw a meme about, you know, so how many times I've written, I hope you are well, in the introduction to your email. You know, it's like we're forced in through politeness, through this idea of positive psychology, and, you know, oh, just be happy, just follow, you know, it's like, just go for the happy things in life. Well, it doesn't work like that. You know, research from the 1940s or 1930s said that we spend 60% of our time suffering and 40% of our time in happy spaces. So we got to find a way to make peace with that 60% of our time. Otherwise, most of our lives won't be, you know, in a place of balance.
Well, no, absolutely. And we've got to stop. You're right. We have to stop the dance. And it is a dance, isn't it? How are you? I'm fine. I hope you're well. Well, so do I. But I'm dying inside. All these sort of things. The reality is, whilst we are different, and not everybody's on the same boat, and people object to that sort of phrase because they all come from different things, we do have some of the same feelings. Some of it might be very minor to other people, but the anxiety that can cause to the individual, that's what we recognize. You know, if I prick you, do not bleed. If I tickle you, do not laugh. You know, the Shakespearean sentiment. You work on that sort of principle where people are the same, and recognizing that sort of anxiety, that it is okay not to be okay, but how can we accept that so that we can then move on, and without the frustration of trying to find a solution when none exists? Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was kind of thinking, you know, back to, you know, this idea of also what to do, and religion. You know, for me, you know, this is my view of it, you know, transpersonal or religious experiences, you know, happen through great art. You know, when you're moved, or, you know, you see, you know, a great vista of nature or something like that. And there's also a place in all of this for play and magic and wonder. And, you know, to really recognize, I remember, I can't remember the name of the artist. I remember going to the Tate, Britain, and they've got the Great Grand Hall. And, you know, in the Great Grand Hall, there's this amazingly big sculpture. And you just got to go, for all the badness of the humanity, we're also capable of creating great pieces of art, you know, that just defy, you know, the amount of work that had gone into that. And you know, as yourself, you know, as someone who is intimately familiar with magic, you know, this idea that also we can see the wonder of the world. We can also see, you know, even through our own suffering, we can still connect and be moved by books or music or art or, magic.
And
And that to me is a related experience.
Yeah, and it's remembering that wonder. I mean, the best advice we give to magicians, it's rather like performers. I mean, we're all dealing with the entertainment world. They might sing the particular song and they've sung it a zillion times. I had the somebody who was worked with Toya, for example, who does pantomime for 25 years. They played the Ghostbuster theme tune for 13,500 times. They worked it out in their head, but each time you remember the feeling you get with the audience. And it's the same when advising magicians, because they learn the tricks. It doesn't matter what you do, it's how you do it. And if you remember the wonder that you felt the first time you saw that bit of magic, the fact that you've done it a zillion times is irrelevant. Recreate that magic moment. That's the real magic, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I have nothing but awe for, I think for performers and for people who create magical experiences for people, and places of wonder, because as human beings, often people would say, one of the commonalities is, how do you make yourself feel better? Well, I go sit in nature, or I go, sit on a beach, or I go, see and connect myself into something bigger. Sometimes our suffering is inside of us, and there's, we don't have choice around that. It's there. But it also doesn't mean that we can't also, it's like having a both and. It's not I suffer versus I'm happy. It's like going, I can suffer and I can appreciate, something bigger than me. So it's like I can hold both experiences inside of me. And again, for people who are performers, recognizing that it's a real gift you are offering when you're transporting people to a different world. As I said, some of my deepest belly laughs have been watching, things that have been produced during COVID. And actually for myself, as where do I get my therapy from? Well, it's really having a deep release and belly laugh, and recognizing, because it gives you that, it's just life affirming, and then sometimes it's not saying, oh, well, if you use something life affirming, it will make the sadness better. But it's going, well, if you're going to be sad, you might as well be life affirmed at the same time, if you can hold both as true.
Absolutely. So, as I say, lockdown is easing off because people are trying to get back. A lot of people will be, unfortunately, in a much worse position than they were beforehand. Lots of challenges, all sorts of mixed messages in the media continue. What advice, and big general question, but what advice would you give people who are coming into this stage and as to how to cope?
Patience with self. I think recognizing that it's a highly emotive space. So if emotions appear, I think, there's a saying, I think everything's a mountain rather than a molehill at the moment. And then to go, well, I don't understand. I used to be able to deal with X and now they're really, upsetting me or pissing me off, or I used to be able to do this. To go, well, everything is a much more amped up stage. So if you are bothered by things that wouldn't bother you, or you're having strong emotional experiences, to give yourself permission to have those experiences, because I think it's normal. I think we're decompressing and we've gone, very quickly, things are changing. So, if I go, well, I don't know how to go out, or I don't know how to do this, or my boss is pissing me off, or, whatever it is, just acceptance and go, yeah, no wonder. We live in highly emotive places. So if emotions are strong, then the next question is, and therefore, what do you need to do with that? What do you need to do for your anxiety or your anger, or how do you salve it? How do you self-care with it? And again, if you are a person who, on reflection during this time, has recognized that there's a part of self that you really want some support with, or something in your life that you have recognized that actually, is causing you a sense of suffering, do not suffer, and seek some help with it, accepting that it's painful, and then going and getting some support. I think, and the more that we can find a way to come back as society, as friends, and intimacy, or hugs, or, when that becomes possible, recognizing, as you said, hopefully the small things become really important. People will get the joy and recognize, the privilege of being able to go out, meet your friend, have a hug, order a coffee, the coffee comes to the table, etc. Yeah, sure.
And I think it's the realization that we're not alone. People who are suffering, you've all got the different things. You're not alone. But and help is at hand. It is not only help at being radically accepting, but also if they need guidance through this sort of side, tell them the extra help they can get and how they can get in touch with you.
For me personally, my website is bemoreU.co.uk. Occasionally pop up on Facebook, but my website, you can Google me, and again, just to promote other therapists, there's great organizations like welldoing.org that have a real great system of support around helping you find therapists, great resources on there. And there's the usual counseling directory and therapy directory and all of those things. There's so much, we have access to so much information. Find support and find something that really, and someone you really want to help you with in these times.
Fantastic. Jonathan, it is always a pleasure having you. I look forward to welcoming you back on the show. But for now, Jonathan Goldsmith, thank you very much for your time.
And again, thank you so much for having me back.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So thank you very much indeed to my guest, Jonathan Goldsmith. If you are affected by any of the issues on the show, then please do get in touch. You can write to me at guests@octopustv.com. Also, if you have suggestions as to other people who you'd like to hear from, then do let me know. In any event, don't forget to subscribe to Octopus TV. Follow me at Andrew Eborn at Octopus TV on all the usual platforms. But always remember, it is okay not to be okay. We are all suffering to some degree, and there is help out there. And I think that's the important message for today. But for now, I've been Andrew Eborn. Thank you again to Jonathan Goldsmith, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.